Welcome to Avoiding the Valley of Death video PowerPoint, Essential Structures for Effective Presentations. We all know that to make your presentation successful, you have to get someone's attention. Space-time perception is different for everybody. Our visual memory is faulty, and we can only digest certain amounts of information at a time before we have overload, fatigue, and stress. So to engage people's brains, to get them to think and to learn, you one, need to know your enemy, two, need to choose the correct information and evidence to include in your message, and three, plan your attack appropriately. And this includes avoiding the valley of death. The valley of death in our presentations is the point in the middle of the presentation where you can see everyone nodding off. We don't want that to happen. So you have to structure your presentation in a way that information flows, that you're creating tension and keeping people captivated with your stories and information to get them from point A to point B without nodding off. So to do this, you plan your attack appropriately. You look at what worked in the past. You take structures that exist and adapt them to the situation that you're in now. And then you use best practices in sequencing and storytelling to create coherence and connection and information flow. So how do we do this? Let's look at the initial presentation patterns. Most presentations, in fact almost all presentations, begin with the bottom line on top, where you frame for the audience, showing them the benefit of the information that you're sharing or why it's important to them. Then you provide essential details and evidence, then read the frame and call to action. So we're going to look at this in relation to informational messages and persuasive messages. The strategy is very similar, but there are slight differences. We'll begin with informational messages. So typically, we're going to start with the bottom line on top. You're going to tell your audience why it's important and how the information you're sharing is relevant and important to them. One way that you can begin to do this is by hooking your audience in and using 7, or sometimes people argue 5, narrative structures. Now these narrative structures can help you frame your message. There are 7, or some people say 5, we'll cover 7 in this PowerPoint, narrative structures. Let's take a closer look at them. The first example, or story type, is overcoming the monster. You can use this one when there's a threat to your business in some way. It starts with a call, initial success, confrontation, another ordeal, and a miraculous escape. So Star Wars would be the prime example of this story type. Second, we have the quest, which is embarking on a new initiative. Again, you have a call in the journey, arrival and frustration, there's things you didn't anticipate, final ordeals, and you finally get to your goal at the end, the big ring. Lord of the Rings trilogy would be an example of the quest. Third is the voyage and return. This is a shared experience where you fall into another world. There's initial fascination, things work, but then it turns out not to be so wonderful. There's frustration and nightmare. Within a thrilling escape and return, everything turns out okay. An example of this type would be The Wizard of Oz. Fourth, you've got the comedy, resolving some sort of misunderstanding. There's a confusion, which actually turns into a nightmare. You get new information, which transforms the situation. Example of this might be War and Peace. Fifth, you have the tragedy, pending bankruptcy due to mismanagement, or something similarly depressing. Anticipation. Then there's a dream. You try to accomplish that dream and encounter frustration. Turns into a nightmare and ultimate destruction. Incredibly depressing. Hamlet would be an excellent example of the tragedy story. Sixth, we have the rebirth. Hero falls under a dark power. It seems like it's going to be okay, but not really. It's a living death. The dark power seems to have triumphed, but in the end, there's miraculous redemption. Story of this, maybe Sleeping Beauty would work. Finally, the seventh story type, if you think there are 7 instead of 5, is rags to riches, sudden success. Think about Annie and Daddy Warbucks. There's wretchedness, some success, there's some major crisis, and then there's independence with the final ordeal, which ends in a reunion. So those are the basic story types: overcoming the monster, the quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, Rebirth, and Rags to Riches. And we use these story types because they tap into our collective memory and unconscious. And memory factor is improved when we use structures and patterns that are already familiar to us. From the time we're young children, we're familiar with narrative structure. And this is why the story and narrative structures work when you're giving an oral presentation. We're used to paying attention, having tension, and then having that tension resolve to encounter another complication all the way through the story. So to carry out the tension in the narrative structure throughout your presentation, not just in the framing of it, we use SCORE, which is Situation, Complication, Resolution, Example. Let's take a closer look at SCORE. The SCORE method consists of presenting a problem, complicating that problem, solving part of the problem, and providing an example or a metaphor or a way to understand and digest the problem, and then complicating it yet again. This creates tension and flow within your presentation. So instead of having an agenda and a table of contents that we just drop back into, in and out of, okay, now we're going onto this section, you have a story that moves in a way that increases memory factor and avoids that valley of death because it has its own smaller peaks and valleys with tensions and resolutions. So SCORE begins with situation. Situation is the problem. And you want to begin with your situation that's painful enough, a question, a problem, where people can identify that something needs to be resolved. And then you complicate that problem. Typical complications are people, time, money, risk, uncertainty, or lack of knowledge. Next, with resolution, you respond to the complication raised above. You wrap up with an example that leads to the next complication, and then you repeat the process. So what you see happening is kind of the telling of a story. You present a situation, there's tension, there's a resolution, and an example of how you would apply this or what it means, and then you move on to the next tension or complication that arises out of that example. So you take this SCORE process, and you can use this in the essential details and evidence section of your presentation. So let's move on to persuasive patterns. Persuasive patterns are very similar to informational patterns. However, they have to have a little bit more of a persuasive pull. So again, with a presentation, it's bottom line on top. You can frame and use narrative structures similarly as you did in an informational message, but when we get to the middle part of your message, where it's essential details and evidence, you want to take the situation, background, analysis, recommendations approach. Now this is the SBAR structure, and it's very common for any kind of recommendation message. Not necessarily as useful for a proposal, but in most of your presentations this semester, you'll be making recommendations to your clients. So you can look at situation. This is what is the problem, what do we need to know about it. Background information, this may come from research, doing your needs analysis, or anything else, where you've gathered information to construct the background of the problem that you then solved. Then you analyze the situation. This is where you pull in your research. Finally, you make your recommendation with an action plan, timeline, budget, etc., if that's relevant. So in the analysis section of your SBAR, you're going to use the SCORE structure again. This is where you take some of the data that you've treated, the different levers that you're using, you analyze it, you complicate it, you resolve it by pulling out key findings, synthesizing, showing the WIFI, the benefit, and providing an example of how you'd apply it. Then moving on to the next complication that arises out of that, or the next issue that needs to be addressed as you move towards your solution or recommendation. Additionally, when you're using the SCORE process, one strategy to consider during the complication aspect to demonstrate that you've done your research is using comparison. So taking the option elimination pattern and putting it in to complicate the situation. This structure allows you to demonstrate research or compare options in a way that's easy for your audience to follow. For example, say you had several different software solutions that you were looking at for your organization. By putting them next to each other and going through them based on your criteria, you're going through option elimination. So you're walking your audience through the process by which you arrived at your solution. This is key and critical to demonstrating the good work and the research that you have done. This strategy can be effective in persuasive messages because it demonstrates the thought process and the reasoning that you used to arrive at your conclusion or your recommendation. So to wrap it up, we know that people prefer examples to instruction. We know that stories are more persuasive and metaphors are more persuasive than simply presenting evidence. We know that memory factor improves when we're using similar or familiar patterns. So use these patterns effectively in your presentations to avoid the valley of death.